Good morning, all. My name is Paul Reynaud. I'm the Regional Sales Director for Splunk South Africa, and welcome to our webinar. I would just like to, first of all, thank you for attending. This will be hosted by Herman Singh, who is part of the Future Advisory, and it'll be a series of webinars that we're running, effectively focusing on a number of business topics that are topical to the market and around topics that we see of value to you and to the market. This one is initially around the data-driven enterprise. There'll be other topics on a similar basis. So you can expect further in the series, and in the future ones, we'll get industry panelists and spokesperson in to attend with us. Right now, it's myself and Robert Swanepoel, who is the SE manager for South Africa. So I'm sure you didn't come to see me, you came to see Herman and his normal insights. So the format will be that we'll have about a 20-minute TED talk, like format. Herman will go through some of the topics, and then we'll have a panel discussion. Please feel free to post questions in the chat if topics should become of interest, and we'll address them as we go along. Without further ado, Herman, off you go. You're on mute.
Hi, folks. A real pleasure to be with you. Just wanted to confirm you can see my screen. It's a pleasure to be here with you in what we're going to be running as a series of webinars looking at the data-driven enterprise. We've themed it Follow the Money, Follow the Data, and it's really designed to be a series of webinars aimed at achieving a couple of things. One is to share with you just the power of data and the way in which companies are using data, the power of observability, and the critical need to manage data from a security perspective, from an operations perspective, and from an innovation perspective. And throughout this series, we're going to be expanding on various elements of that. In today's webinar, we're going to be doing a case study, and in fact, we'll do a case study in all of the webinars. And we're going to be diving into a company that, in fact, had exposure to all three. They really needed to resolve all three of these. So the intention today is really to explore the paradox of a very competitive world. A world where we're trying to be quick to market, we're trying to be rapid, but at the same time, we're trying to be very resilient and safe and secure. And so the case study I wanted to use was Zoom video communications, where I wanted to just share with you and to demonstrate what happens when you drive a business to digitize and how born digital firms are making use of cloud, the role that observability plays in these companies, and then to look at how agility aids responsiveness through the use of data, and to explore a little bit the trade-off that exists between managing a customer experience while at the same time ensuring that we build very secure systems, which appears to be a paradox because it's difficult to achieve both simultaneously. And then finally, of course, the challenge of having to scale and deploy new functionality fast while making sure that systems remain stable while we do that. Now, please, just a reminder that you should please post your questions into the chat, and we'd love to deal with them as we get to the end. As I said, this is a brief TED talk, so it'll be about 50 to 20 minutes. So the paradox, and this is the paradox, folks. I mean, those of us that have been involved in building large IT systems that are consumer-facing know that we are challenged by the challenge of both being agile and fast to market, while at the same time building systems that are resilient. And so in the past, it's been an either-or situation. What we're going to look at today is an example of breaking that paradox. How do we resolve the paradox? It's called the tyranny of the or. You can either have speed or you can have resilience, but you can't have both. I'll be sharing with you a case study of a company that in fact achieved both. And then in the panel discussions, we'll explore a little bit how that was done. Now, the company Zoom, I guess, is amazing. We've all used it. And in fact, in March last year, they had in February last year, they only had 10 million users. By April or May, they had 300 million users. This is a company that had a 30x growth in 8 weeks. Now, in my experience as a business person, and I'm sure many of you as well, you've probably never seen a business that grew 30 times in 8 weeks. This company did. So the case study, I want to just give you a little bit of a prelude. Who's Zoom? Where did it come from? How did it grow? What was this existential crisis that they were faced with? How did they return to innovation, and where did they land? And in the panel discussion, we'll explore some of the lessons that come out of that and eke out some key guidance and takeouts for basically South African businesses, global businesses, but also people on the call. So where did this company come from? Well, Zoom was launched in 2011. It was founded in 2011, launched in 2013. So this company is old. It's a 10-year-old company, right? It was founded in San Jose in California. Eric Yuan is ethnically Chinese, but he's an American citizen. Raised a total of $146 million. He raised $3 million in June of 2011, then 6, then 6.5, then 30, and he had quite a large Series D round of about $100 million. So in total, he raised 146 million. He IPO'd in about 2017, 18, at about $9 billion. So 17 investors who invested $146 million were very pleased because their $146 million turned into $9 billion, right, overnight after they listed the company. And the model was largely freemium, and it was largely a business focus. Zoom was intended to be a business focused tool. And if you look at the way in which Zoom was designed and you compare it to Microsoft Teams and WebEx, you can see it was, if you compare them from the number of people on a call, is it cloud, is it on-prem, what devices can I use, how long can I talk for, does it have HD, can I share files? To a large extent, it was pretty similar, right? So there wasn't a huge difference between Zoom and Microsoft Teams, except for this. Zoom really it was very cheap and very easy to deploy, and part of the reason it was cheap and easy to deploy is it had a very low security footprint. It didn't need a big and deep integration, and it didn't have rules around, it didn't have end-to-end encryption, it didn't have very stringent accessibility and rights and privilege rules, didn't have waiting rooms, and didn't even have a PIN, actually, to log in. So this was Zoom, and Zoom was pottering along, as I said, 10 million customers, valued at about 9 billion. The valuation probably had jumped to about 12 billion by the time we hit February 2020. Then the future arrived 9 years early, right? We were expecting that by 2028, in fact, this was a forecast made in 2019, that by 2028, 73% of all teams would have remote workers. Well, we got a shock because that may have been true in February of 2020, but by 2018, by 2020 April, we already had half of the workers in the world pretty much working from home. And more importantly, we had 4.5 billion people in lockdown, and we had 1.4 billion students studying from home. So homeschooling suddenly took off. And in fact, Eric Yuan realized that, wow, this was a great opportunity for someone. So he pivoted the business away from a business focus to a consumer focus, and he went after schools. So Zoom basically went in and focused heavily on online learning, specifically for schools. And so by using schools as a use case, that introduced a number of complications because the product hadn't been designed for schools. And many people don't realize this when we look at where Zoom came from. They had to make some big changes. So the first change that they had to make was from a feature point of view. They had to create an account sign-up process that was easy for teachers and students to sign up. You had to have a single sign-on. You needed to deploy for both iOS and Android. A lot of people were using mobile devices. Well, they got that done by the 6th of March. Remember, most of the country of the world started going down into lockdown at the end of February, beginning of March. And I think South Africa, we went into lockdown at the end of March. But the following week, they deployed free multi-language educator training for all of the teachers. But the following week, they implemented live and recorded best practices for teachers. And during that same week, they implemented the Khan Academy material as well as some of the National Museum material. By the 27th, they'd implemented a PIN number per session, and they were rolling out a deal with Logitech bundles. So you could get headsets and webcams, etc., and microphones. And by the end of March, they'd already activated waiting rooms by default, and they'd built an educator security block. So that was remarkably quick deployment of new functionality. The next problem they had to deal with was the fact that they had a 40-minute limit on free basic accounts, and they couldn't simultaneously do this for the entire world. So they gradually started uplifting it. And of course, you had to deploy multi-language capability per country. And so for the first week in March, They took 3 countries live. You remember, Italy was very heavily hit in March of last year. So they chose Italy to take that. I think they had one of the hardest lockdowns in the world. The following week, they took a few more, but 7 or 8 more countries. And you can see by the end of March, they pretty much were starting to cover most of the big countries in the world. India went live on the 27th, and that was a couple of 100 million people that went live. You can imagine now, multi-language, new functionality, and a huge load onto the system. Well, the uptake was obvious. You can see the uptake of all web conferencing products, but look at the uptake of Zoom. And you can see that if you look at the download for mobile devices through the app stores, Zoom was #1 in April for downloads. And it was actually, and this is for non-games, of course, both the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. Zoom was #1 download. Well, this had a huge impact. You can see the number of users in December were 10 million, and they went from 10 million to 300 million. There's your 30x growth, and the value of Zoom jumped from around 19 billion is where it was on the 10th of December. I'm sorry, in December 2019. By September of 2020, it had hit 150 billion dollar valuation. That's a 7x growth in valuation. Eric Yuan, who was the founder of the company, said, well, great opportunity here to serve the world, but this experience has been tough. Over the past 2 months, I've hardly had any sleep, and I wouldn't wish this extreme growth on anyone. Step-by-step sustainable growth is still the best. So great story so far. Then they hit a major existential crisis right after that, where what happened was there a series of challenges that really created a huge level of distrust in management. The first problem was Zoom bombings, where people would just dive into and breach Zoom meetings. We then had a problem where data leakages were occurring, where information about users as well as video recordings were being leaked. The next problem was privacy, where other people could view what you were doing. The next problem was the quality of service. I'll show that. In fact, let me show you that quickly. If you look at the UK, for example, this is how Zoom operated on British Telecom, on Sky, on TalkTalk, on Virgin. This was the latency. But look at Google Meet, GoToMeeting, Microsoft Teams, Skype, and WebEx, and you can see Zoom had a fundamental problem. They were almost 7 times worse in terms of latency. So the servers just couldn't handle that traffic. There wasn't a network problem. That was really a server problem, and the way in which they'd architected their entire system. So they had a quality of service problem, a reliability problem was the next thing. Zoom would go down. So Zoom was sitting here with a series of problems where consumers were saying, look, it's not safe. It's not running. I don't have the functionality. Go back to my 3 opening points: security, operations, innovation. I don't have the right features. I've got a problem with the system availability and performance, and I've got some serious security issues. This is a perfect storm for the company. Now, what happened on the security front was horrendous. I mean, if this happened to any other company, it would be considered to be a nightmare. At the end of March, we had the first Zoom bombings happened. The New York AG then got involved. Facebook announced that they were having a Facebook data challenge. There were breaches. On the 1st of April, the first class action lawsuit was brought against Zoom. More bugs were revealed in that week. Data mining was revealed as a problem. People were mining data. SpaceX immediately banned Zoom for usage in its company. It was then announced, and it was then disclosed that in fact Zoom didn't have end-to-end encryption. The following week, Zoom made a public apology. They then uncovered that there were a number of Zoom raids being planned, and Zoom meeting data was accessible. The United States Congress then requested information on what was happening. The second class action lawsuit was brought. By the 15th of April, it was disclosed that many calls were going through Chinese servers, obviously a big issue, especially for the Europeans and the Americans. We then found that many Zoom accounts were found on the dark web. Taiwan then banned Zoom, and some schools began banning Zoom as well. By the 3rd week of April, it became clear that Zoom was vulnerable to foreign surveillance. PIN numbers per session were breached. Malware was then discovered that was recording the sessions. By the 1st of May, in fact, the New York Attorney General had closed the inquiry because Zoom gave the assurance that they would solve end-to-end encryption, and they bought a security company. At the same time that they were doing this, in fact, at the same time that they were doing this, competitors were diving in. This is an example of Jio. Reliance Jio in India is the biggest telecommunications company. They launched something called Jio Meet. I mean, it's actually embarrassing. They didn't even bother changing the icons, barely changed the colors. It's Jio Meet is just a replica of Zoom. So Zoom is in a very difficult problem. Innovation had come to a halt, operations were in disarray, and security was collapsing. From the perspective, all of these are from the perspective of the consumer. Now this company was in a difficult position because they were living with a news cycle crisis. The ability to capture and manage the growth was no accident, but the problem is, although they built a great company, they had this big challenge. Luckily, Eric Yuan had built an amazing company with great vision, a great attitude. And in fact, Eric Yuan could have started charging for Zoom. He chose not to. He said, we want to do well by doing good, which are very rare. Many companies would have started charging for this, especially in a crisis. He chose not to do that. What he then did is he then made this amazing decision to, in fact, stop all new product feature development. And he said, what we're going to do is we're going to solve the security problems first, prioritize security over innovation. It's very similar to decisions that were made at Microsoft and Google, in fact, when they had problems that were very similar. In fact, and so you've got this challenge. What do we do? Security versus usability. So over the next 90 days, Eric Yuan said, we committed to dedicating the resources needed to better identify, address, and fix issues proactively. We also committed to being transparent throughout this process. We want to do what it takes to maintain your trust. And it was really phenomenal watching them do that. As I said, they'd bought a company on the 8th of May. You can see the announcement. That's remarkable for a company to move this quickly, to buy a company that does end-to-end encryption and to deliver it onto their platform within this very limited period of time. Remarkably agile performance. In fact, by then they'd scaled up their service to the point where Zoom was able to offer unlimited video calling for New Year's and for Christmas. By December, they were so confident that their service could handle that traffic. What they then did is they then went back to product innovation, implemented a new revenue-based model where you could get the free service, but if you wanted the pro service, you'd have to pay. And of course, there was the enterprise model as well. As a result of this, fixing the security problems, resolving the operational issues, and bringing in the new features that people might now be willing to pay for, Zoom's revenue began to grow. Remember, this is a free service with no advertising. How is their revenue growing? Well, through subscriptions. And you can see that, through quarter one and quarter two, enormous growth in users, no growth in revenue. Quarter three, the gradual beginning of revenue growth, and this enormous spurt in quarter two of 2021. All because they were able to convince companies that there was value and it was worth subscribing. And so you started getting professionals subscribing. They then started bringing in Zoom phones, Zoom rooms. And in fact, you could now integrate Zoom into multiple devices, services, platforms, and you had a 360 feature available for web traffic. They then did something amazing. They started to bring in a full collaboration suite. If you look at Microsoft allows you to communicate on the Microsoft platform. You're able to collaborate on the platform. You're able to share content on the platform. You're able to manage business processes on the platform. And in fact, you're able to manage people on the platform. And in fact, you don't have to use Microsoft. There are many third-party services that basically help us live remotely and manage as a professional on the internet. We don't have to go into the office anymore. Basically, we've appified the office, and software has eaten our work. In fact, Zoom ended up, because of what they did in terms of the apps that they were bringing on, Zoom went back to becoming, if you look at the Gartner Golden Quadrant and you look at ability to execute and completeness of vision, I mean, Zoom is beating Cisco, Microsoft, and Google and Blue Jeans. Blue Jeans was bought by Verizon, as well as Huawei. It's actually astonishing to see a company just leapfrog the competitors and suddenly go to the front of the field. In fact, if you look at the traffic growth and the traffic volume, you can see that Zoom is light years ahead of just about anyone else. Zoom's number one. There's actually no number two in this industry. And the share price, although it came off the peak, has still held up pretty well. Now, what are some of the lessons that we can learn here? Well, clearly, one of the key things that they had to focus on was data, right? And part of the challenge was, well, we've got to observe what what use cases does the market have? How are users using Zoom? What are some of the security incidents that are happening? How is the system being breached? What's the usage trends? When is it being used? Where's our peak load? And then, of course, their responses. How do you prioritize based on this data? And so they went from a process of understanding using descriptive statistics, then being able to predict where their demand was going to be and what the new features needed to be. And then, of course, implementing some of these prescriptive analytics. Remember, they also shared this analytics with their users. I'll share with you some of that. And the way in which they prioritized and executed was key. And all of this was based on data, a data-rich approach. So Eric Yuan was basically a man with a plan. Right, and there were three elements to his plan. Basically, there was an element of automation and orchestration. How can I make sure that I automate the way that I run this platform? How do I make sure I've got auditing and compliance, and I've got automation of my security processes? How do I make sure that I mitigate risk through detection of threats, through fraud detection, and through responding to incidents very quickly? And how do I ensure that I implement security analytics so that I monitor, obviously, internal threats as well as monitoring the perimeter and some of the events that were happening? Key to this was really making sure that you access data from everything. So it didn't matter whether it was security data, network data, servers, smartphones. Any machine data that was available needed to be ported, because the IT users needed to get access to this data. The analysts needed access. The business users needed to know when is Zoom getting loaded, who's using it, where they're using it, which features are being used. And the security analysts needed data to understand how the events were happening and where the vulnerabilities might exist, which really introduces us to this concept of observability. And observability really says that what we need to start doing is gathering any type of data, any volume of data, any source of data, and ensuring that we put it through this analytical framework so that we can basically ask any question. How are our applications being delivered? How are we managing our operations? How is security compliance and fraud being managed? What can we see about the usage in terms of business analytics? And if there's any industrial data, well, how is the system performing? Because obviously industrial data in particular is very sensitive. So Zoom basically had this amazing platform. They created this observability suite, which allowed them to monitor everything that was happening on that platform. And it was actually very powerful because they were able to orchestrate, manage, monitor endpoints, and manage and provision identity and rights. The stages that they went through were really a stage of starting with basic collection of data and logs, then the process of normalizing, getting the standard taxonomy in place, then gradually expanding that to bring in more data sources. Once they had high fidelity data, enriching that data to allow them to automate and orchestrate, and finally getting to the level where you can get to advanced detection. And obviously they worked with a number of partners, one of which was Splunk. Later on, if we've got some time, I'd like to play a video. Let's see how the interviews go. And basically they did a huge integration with Splunk, which allowed them to basically use Splunk internally. But very interestingly, they were able to, in fact, create dashboards for their partners. So they created these APIs that they plugged in from Splunk. And you can see that what they were able to do was they could provide an enterprise with how Zoom was being used. So in other words, this is a dashboard for an enterprise user that could show you in your enterprise, how many active Zoom meetings did you have? How many active meeting participants did you have? How many active Zoom webinars were you running, etc.? What was the number of meetings that you were running? How many participants have you had, etc.? And what kind of traffic? And you could actually graph that. So that just gives you a sense of what Zoom was able to deliver, how they basically grew, and what they were able to deliver. And so some of the key lessons that I just wanted to leave you with, and now we'll go to the panel after this, is really, I guess, forewarned is forearmed. So it's important to be mindful and to learn from cases like this. In future webinars, we'll share other cases with you. It's clear that observability aided agility here by understanding security data, monitoring it, analyzing it, by looking at operational data, and by looking at the way in which users were using it, they were able to build a data-driven organization. It's not either or. You were able to, in fact, balance this trade-off. And I want to ask some questions of my panelists of how they did that. And of course, what's key is the summary that data management really aids not just security, but also innovation and operations. There's a few simple things to do. We'll cover them in the balance of the series, but for now, I'd like to just stop at that point and really invite Robert and Paul back into the conversation. So folks, well done, great story, I guess. And I mean, as Splunk, you must be quite proud about being involved in that in some way. And just a reminder to the audience, folks, please, if you wouldn't mind, please go ahead and load your questions. I'd love to be able to pose some of your questions to Paul and to Robert. Paul, just let's open with you. Is this trade-off issue is a big issue? It's coming up all the time. Is there still a trade-off between product functionality and security and system performance? And if so, how should we be thinking about how we address that?
Yeah, Herman, so great content and great value. And maybe what I wanted to say as well is I think you were teaching the Zim case study in your business school long before you found out that Splunk was enabling them. So it sounds like a setup, but it wasn't. Herman's being objective. I didn't pay him to say this. So very, very interesting. But I think where's that trade-off come from? What is the issue around it? You know, traditionally people see that the more data they collect, the more they've got to store it, the more they've got to use it. And how do they search it and how do they maintain it? And this is the discussion around like on-prem and what I do. And it also comes out of the legacy security environment. And I think some of the things that were really, really interesting you highlighted was there's direct correlation on the Zoom case study between an improved security posture and a massive growth in revenue. So people are aware of that. Secondly, I think the other thing that you point out is that traditionally the security posture is a legacy thing that's retroactive, whereas we change that culture to start looking proactively at the data and using tools, and this is where the trade-off comes in, to mine that data for additional information for the enterprise. So I think you know, the theme of the data-driven enterprise that you're now given as the theme of the series allows us to really address what the future will hold and how we can mine that data and the potential for those models. And I think Robert will address this in some of these topics, to uncover business models that we would not necessarily have either been able to operationalize around insurance and things like that, or you know, the being able to proactively do policing and things like that. You know, some of the stories about capturing Osama bin Laden. If we couldn't correlate all these data points, we'd not be able to see some of the patterns that are there. So there is a trade-off. We need to focus on this, but it's also, I think, you know, a future discussion around the quick and the dead. If you don't have a data-driven enterprise, what does the future hold for you? So I would put it around those metrics.
Very good. You know, I was running a program in Singapore, and one of the really interesting insights that came up was that software developers in Singapore were using data-driven insights, not only to look at which product features were used the most, but which product features were used the least. In other words, why did we build this functionality, right? Because we spent this money building this functionality, now no one's using it. And so that's great insight. And just a further point on that, Paul, how important do you think tools are there? Because I mean, are tools critical in managing this kind of trade-off?
I think the thing is, we see every enterprise, especially if they get into a maturing field, like let's just take cloud, they start bringing in tools to monitor and manage silos. So for example, you'll see like in the space of observability, it's a new field, and there's lots of different players and everything starts coalescing. And then at one time or another, the data in the silos becomes its own limitation. In other words, the functionality and the information you're getting out of the silo now becomes limited because you can't ingest data from other platforms. So you then start seeing consolidation of tools. And I think this data to everything type platform is ingest the data into a platform, reducing the silos, and then surface the data out of the platform based on the dashboard and the search. And the example you gave of Zoom being able to give a custom dashboard on the enterprise side around how an enterprise is using, you know, that's real value. That is real value to an enterprise. You know, there are very few cloud applications like that could surface that data as effectively as what you showed there.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I want to just make this point to the audience as well, that if you're going to charge people for what was previously free, you better have insights into which of the product features are most valuable, because that now allows you to charge customers for that, which implies analytics. So thanks, Paul. Great comment. Robert, if I can bring you in here, what kind of advice would you give to our audience as best practices in avoiding the kind of challenges that we experienced at Zoom? I mean, I guess with hindsight, Zoom, I guess if they'd known what would happen, nobody could have guessed, right? 30x growth. But I guess, if you could have given advice, what would that advice be?
Well, I think the Zoom case study actually gives the answers to that. And I mean, you alluded to on one of your slides there where you talked about that. They had a culture around using data, they had a culture around security. And I think if you look at it there, the best practice is to solve this culturally and technically. I mean, technically, Paul touched on there with the tool spaces. That's perhaps maybe the easiest way of doing it. And there, the problem is, if you want to distill it, and at the risk of oversimplifying, is really identifying what the problem and challenge is. And we're actually moving from identifying to even predicting now. We've got some customers that are able to predict outages 30 to 40 minutes in advance through using data. And then it's really about making that right decision based on that data. It's making an informed decision. So it's turning your data into action. Now that's easier said than done, because often we're dealing with complex systems across public enterprises, cloud, a mix in between there. You may have a system that changes depending on how it's operating, but maybe bursting into a hyperscaler. So you've got different components. How do you all look at that? How do you take that large complex data set? How do you correlate it and then deliver insights that you can then act on? So that's where the tool set really comes in. And we want to be able to act on that quickly. And that's where that automation orchestration comes in. And we start building machine learning and orchestration in the tool set. Now that's great. And I think Zoom did that very successfully. But I think what was also critical to there was that culture part. That they considered data and security and everything. And I think that's something we all need to be cognizant of and start building into our and evangelizing in our enterprises. Make data and security part of your culture. When you're developing application, are you thinking about what data it processes, what data it produces? How are you going to capture that data? How are you going to use that data? How are you going to secure it? That's the sort of investment we need to be making now, because the payoff is going to aid us in the future decision making. It's going to give us more data to address the future challenges. That's going to allow us to get more insights and to really create that actionable insight that we can respond to those challenges with.
Super. Thanks, Robert. I've got a wonderful set of questions, folks. Please keep those questions coming. I mean, I think Robert, Paul, we're going to get a little bit stretched here, but let's try our hands at this. Ian van Rensburg. Hi, Ian. Good to hear from you. Ian asked a really interesting question. Do you know how Zoom resolved their server latency issue? Now, I know how they did it. I'm just checking. Paul, Robert, do either one of you want to try to answer that? If not, I'm happy to give it a shot.
I think go ahead, Herman.
Okay, cool. So look, I mean, Ian, what they did, I mean, obviously it's a combination of load balancing, but critically, I'm going to use an Amazon word, and then I'm going to contradict myself. I mean, it's really about elastic computing, right? It's about scaling up, scaling out elastically, dynamically, and bursting capacity. Now, the reason I said I'm going to contradict myself is they're not sitting on Amazon, they're actually sitting on Oracle. So really, in March of 2020, they made the decision to go to Oracle Cloud, and they've been able to manage their latency in that way. So really, very elastic platform. But again, I'm using the Amazon terminology to describe an Oracle platform. So I hope that answers your question. Belinda's got a yes. Go ahead, please.
Maybe add to that. I was actually reading something interesting that while AWS and Oracle both are claiming Zoom as one of their large providers, Zoom actually makes considerable use of co-location, their own infrastructure as well. So it really is a hybrid model that they are utilizing.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, they moved to the core was moved to Oracle in March, and they announced it in March 2020, and they moved over in April. But clearly, you want to be in a hybrid model. Thank you. Thanks for that, Robert. And Ian, I hope that answers part of your question. Belinda asks a question. And Robert, maybe it's a question for you. So Belinda in Lobo's question is, do you think it's prudent? What a great question, Philinda. Do you think it's prudent to combine operations performance monitoring and security monitoring on the same platform? I love that question. Robert, do you want to give that a shot?
I'll give that a shot. I'll try to be prudent in my response as well, because as a sales engineer by trade, it's always a case of it depends. But let me put the case here that we've got a lot of customers that are doing just that. And why is that? One, it simply makes sense. We're typically using a lot of the same data. Security is interested in the operating system logs, it's interested in the firewall logs. We're looking at that from an availability performance monitoring point of view, troubleshooting from that from a operations and performance monitoring as well. And also there's an interlinkage. If you think a performance issue could be an indication of a security incident. A security incident could result in downtime. So having an overall view, I think there's value in that. But I think the Zooming use case actually gives us a really great example of how they've integrated the security and IT DevOps, because we can't view them as separate domains anymore because they aren't interlinked. I mean, in Zoom's case, they found that obviously as their security posture increased, their revenue increased. There was a direct correlation for them. And that may be an extreme example, but I think that same correlation applies for most of the enterprises out there. So is it prudent to do it? Let me phrase it this way. How did your security change when your last application release was released? Did it improve? Did it worsen? And then ask yourself, how often are you doing those application releases? Because gone are the days when we are rolling out a new release or a software change every 6 months to 12 months. We may be doing this multiple times a day. How do you keep track of that? How are you correlating that data? If you don't have all that data in a single system, you don't have a single system that's got a view of both your DevOps, your operations monitoring, as well as your security, it's very difficult to correlate that. Now, I do get there are obviously some concerns around, well, security and isolation, but a lot of that can be handled through role-based access and isolation of data, etc., within the various tool sets depending on the tool set you're using. So at the end of the day, getting back to that, it depends. It's really going to be up to you as an enterprise to weigh up the value that I've just sort of talked about, that being able to understand your security posture and how it changes as you do software releases versus that perceived safety of having an isolated security environment.
Yeah.
And that's going to depend on your individual security posture and your policies.
Lovely. Great comment. Thanks, Robert. And just another point, I've just been told that actually Zoom signed a multi-year deal with Amazon in December 2019, but then moved its core platform to Oracle in March and transitioned in April, and it's currently sitting on both platforms. So exactly right, it's a hybrid platform on both sides. Thank you. And thanks for that, Philinda. I hope that answers your question. Paul, I've got another great question here from Nomzamo. I had prepared some questions, but I must be honest, the audience questions are far better than mine. You know what? I'm going to do all my exams like this and get crowd-funded questions, crowdsourced questions. Nomzamo's question is, and Paul, maybe you best placed to answer this one. Could you explain what exactly is included in the term observability? I think that's a good question because for many of us, that's a very brand new term. Paul?
Yeah, and I think it's the new hot term. So it's worthwhile unpacking it because when I joined Splunk, I also didn't have a clue as to what observability was. So no different. We've invented a term to cover a whole series of events. And I think Robert alluded to some of it. At a very high level, the type of thing we're seeing in observability is what Robert alluded to, is around predictability of system outage. So on the one side, we are ingesting metrics and logs and doing searches, looking for patterns and events that happen from a security point of view, which is retroactive, okay? Observability plays in the space of more forward-looking, in other words, trending of the data and patterning of the data. So, of course, to be able to do that, the higher fidelity of the data and the more accurate my information is, the more I can extract the patterns, okay? So this is like where we start to see mean time to respond of negative. In other words, 30 or 40 minutes before an incident happens, I can start to predict something happening. And I mean, Herman, you know, the one I think of, we're using Zoom, but when I was in lockdown, I had nothing to do, so I got into Zwift. And I used to pedal my bike. And I remember one morning sitting on Zwift, and there were 35,000 people in a virtual world. And I sat and I looked at the scale of that, and I thought, this thing must be spinning up VMs in some cloud system, you know, and then it scales it up and scales it down. So they must have some incredibly advanced tools to predict the demand. And they have to do that in a way that it's forward-looking. In other words, I can see the demand, spin it up, but I don't want to leave it there. Okay, so that just gives an example of kind of what observability is about. And then I think further to what Robert was talking about is, and you alluded to it, Herman, is the future arrived 9 years early, also from a digitization point of view. And there were many, many companies that didn't have a digital strategy, because I tried to order from them and it was broken. So they had a nominal presence. So all of a sudden the devs went crazy to bring this digital presence to the fore to be able to compete in this economy. The problem is they didn't bring the security posture with it. So you've got a big divorce in most legacy companies between DevOps and SecOps, and neither the twain shall meet, and they don't speak the same language, and they don't like being in the same room, even to the point you asked Robert about ingesting security logs on a platform that you're using for analytics. You know, security wants to be in a silo on their own, and they've traditionally been in that walled silo. Now, what you're trying to do with observability is create a DevSecOps culture. In other words, the security posture in the app is considered before I throw it over the wall into production, okay? And then I'm monitoring it in real time to see what issues I'm getting. So it is also an organization and a cultural shift that you've got to be able to do to bring these two culturally different silos, one being traditionally focused on security, which is going to be more, you know, lockdown, keep functionality limited, and another one that's focused on innovation. And the point that Robert made is interesting, is when you deployed your last app, did you improve your security posture or did you reduce your security posture? What was the impact of it and how do you monitor that? So I hope that gives some context and some idea of what observability is about, but you're not alone. It is a new buzzword. There are lots of competitors. Splunk got in the space through an acquisition called SignalFX. And I think a lot of companies are starting to get to terms with you know, observability as a concept right now.
Okay.
If I can maybe add to that, Herman, something that I took from one of your slides where you said, you know, insights from hindsights. And to me, that kind of summarizes observability. It's being, if we looked at monitoring, it was, we knew what we needed to know. We need to know, say, CPU, disk utilization, etc., like that. We knew what metrics we were after. In the new complex systems that we're talking about, we're not even sure what metrics it should be. What is normal behavior? What is good behavior? And observability is being able to look at your system over time and then ask those relevant questions to get an understanding of what good behavior is, get an understanding of when something happens, what it's going to indicate. So I really liked your insights through hindsight, and I'm probably going to use that when explaining observability in future. So thank you.
It's 5 Rand every time you use that, Robert.
I'll send you 500 Rand now then.
Thanks, Robert. And it's not mine, by the way. I'm pretty sure I actually got that from someone else as well. We must all copy with pride, hey? I got some great questions in the chat box as well. So please, folks, keep those questions coming. Nomzamo, I hope that Robert and Paul answered that question adequately. And don't worry, by the way, I also had to look up this term when I got involved in this. Ruby asked a really interesting question. Ruby Hansen's question, great question. Looking to the future, and it's obvious, you know, they say forecasting is really difficult, especially about the future. What type of vulnerabilities is Zoom at risk for? Have they looked at deep fakes, for example? Is there already some data-driven alerting being developed? That's a challenging question. Who'd like to take a shot at that one?
It's a very challenging one. So I think in terms of what they're at risk at, I think it's the same as any other enterprise, especially when you open there. And I think we've seen that through things like the SolarWinds attacks and everything there, that the attacks are becoming a lot more creative. So those vulnerabilities, you know, it's difficult. If we know what future risks there are, we close that down. So I think the work that's being done there is obviously, and that's the traditional way we've kind of looked at security, is what is the typical attack and how do we put a place in there. I think what is being done is really about machine learning. It's about AI, it's about automation. It's looking at how can we sort of predict these things? How can we view these anomalies? And this is where you start also applying the observability. So this is what normal looks like. When something is abnormal, then we start asking those questions. And until I got that observability of a system, and let's remember observability is a property. So is a system is observable, it's mean we can tell how well the system is doing internally by looking at it from the outside. And that's what we want to do in a security space as well, is have a look at the system, get an idea of normal, that we can detect any anomaly, even if it's something that we can't and didn't predict. You know, I think everybody's now conscious post-SolarWinds to look at, you know, what are we doing from a release point of view? How do we integrate our DevOps with the security point of view? But we weren't thinking that way 3 or 4 years ago. And I think what we want to get to is not always be 3 to 6 months behind. You know, where you've got an attacker inside your system for, you know, 80 plus days before we can detect it. We want to be detecting that before. We want to be closing those holes beforehand. So I think that's really where the development is focused around. And within Splunk and elsewhere in the marketplace is around, you know, that predictive and using AI and machine learning for that predictive capability, and then dealing with that in rapid time through automation.
Yeah, no, that's wise, and I think I take your point, Robert. You know, it's in a sense, until you've got true AI, all you've got is machine learning, right? And machine learning can only respond to what's being done. I mean, machine learning can't predict in a sense. You really need AI, I think, to guess what the next threat's going to be. I think that's part of the point, right? Paul, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think you actually predicted the next question, Herman, because I see my friend Ishmael is up to his normal tricks of posting curved balls there. So maybe I'll take the question as well, and then we can talk about how we see that panning out. So what he's asking is, when do participants, when do you anticipate cognitive analytics like ML and AI being built into platforms like Zoom, where things like room temperature takes into consideration participant moods based on data at hand? For example, in this call, which part of Herman's presentation was most attractive to the audience? I'm sure the video of each person is sufficient for learning. You know, I think that's a very interesting topic. I think the only thing you can, like you said, until you've got true AI, all you've got is ML, so you're kind of crunching through data. I think we're some way off on this in terms of you need to ingest an enormous amount of data and data points to start being able to do that. So now we're in the world of sensors in a room. You know, are we going to bring out video cams like we're seeing here now with a temperature sensor? Are you going to give that data away? Like you said, you know, we traded our privacy for COVID tracking. All of a sudden, I mean, think of that world of analytics. So I think the piece there becomes the fidelity of the data starts to allow you to extract the patterns and the recognition from it, and then you know, the plan, and it goes to the point I was talking about, then the business models that can be unlocked from that could be things we haven't surfaced or heard of before. And I'm going to steal it from Robert because he alluded to it. You know, like right now, we can put sensors in a car to see how we're driving. In fact, if we are driving, and if we integrate that into an insurance model, then we can do on-demand insurance, okay? So the fidelity of the data and the intelligence around it, around where we're going, et cetera, and the tracking allows us to invent new as-a-service business models. But I think very good question, Ish, and I know you normally are somewhere 3 steps ahead of us, so maybe something we talk about in the future.
No, I think that question for me got me really thinking in terms of, you know, I think where we are in there is we're discovering new use cases for the data we already have. But what Ishmael brings up there is start thinking, and that's not a use case I've previously considered. So, you know, that's a use case that we don't necessarily maybe have the data for. We're not collecting that data. Zoom probably isn't collecting that data. But if you have a use case for it, now we're actually building a use case that now has a new need for new data, and we're going to drive that. I think that's the shift that I'm excited to see in the industry, where we start going from using the data we have to develop use cases, but being so innovative that our new use cases are driving the data that we need to collect. And that's going to, you know, interlink, I think, across the spectrum. And, you know, seeing a use case like that, you know, my mind's really thinking, what can we do with, you know, say, you know, Alexa, if it's controlling your air conditioner, etc., getting that, what can we do there? There's a lot of data to get gathered, but it also may be a case of some of the data we want is not readily available, and how we do going about obtaining that information.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, the heart of what the series is all about is let's rethink about data in terms of what's possible, what's the art of possible for data. And so, Ishmael, fantastic question. It's part of the series is let's provoke thought, and that's really provoked thought, and it's something I'm probably going to think on for a few days' time. So thank you very much. That was great.
Thanks for that question. And if I can just maybe throw in my 2 cents worth as well. I think there's a lot of things you could do to compromise a Zoom session and the Zoom platform without going to deep fakes. I'll talk about deep fakes just now. But for example, a man-in-the-middle attack, right, is actually quite risky. And so, the way in which you set up a session is going to be key. The way in which the keys are exchanged to set up a session, the way that you encrypt it to prevent anyone breaching a session that's already in progress. If you look at most Zoom interference and security issues today, most of it's social engineering. Somebody steals your login. So social engineering is probably your biggest risk. I actually think in the future, a denial of service attack is going to be a big issue because, in the gambling industry, people don't realize this, but one of the big risks in the gambling industry, the online betting industry, is a denial of service attack, because most bets get placed 5 minutes, for example, before an event. Yeah. So if you launch a denial of service attack 5 minutes before the event, you lose 80% of the betting revenue. And so, so that's a big issue, right? And so I suspect for large webinar type events, that's going to be a bigger concern. And of course, the minute Zoom allowed for file exchange and video exchange, and if the minute you go FTP embedded into Zoom, you've got a problem that you've got embedded Trojans that could potentially be possible. You've got to scan every attachment that gets shared. So I think this is a very new space. My personal view is authentication and authorization is going to be bigger issues than actually breaching a fully encrypted session. I think we've got that waxed. And the big risk, of course, is does somebody hack into the back end of Zoom? But I think they've got that pretty well secure. We'll, if we have time, we might even hear from Eric Yuan as well. I've got a great question here, actually, from Ishmael again, on how do we democratize the data-driven decision maker? Meaning, how do we make decision makers confident in decision making? How do we make it such that decision-driven decision making is pleasant rather than scary? And before I throw this open, I just want to say, Ishmael, I remember running Standard Bank's ATM fleet, and I remember that one of the product owners came to me and said, "We want to do check printing on ATMs." And I said, "Why?" He said, "No, customers want to print checks at ATMs." And I said, I've got such a small development team. You really want me to take this valuable resource and put them to develop check printing? And we did, by the way. We actually built a few. It was probably the most wasted effort we had. If I'd had data-driven decision-making and I was confident in its usage, I would have told this guy to go and take a hike. We'd never have built it, right? So just to share with you why that is such a profound question. Any thoughts around that, folks? Who'd like to try that? Robert, you want to kick it off?
I'll try to kick it off. I think it starts with leadership. I really think, we spoke about the technical and the cultural way to address the challenges. It's having that culture. It's empowering people within your organization to take those decisions. It's like in any business. We make mistakes, but if we're doing them for valid reasons, we learn from them and we move forward. And I think we need to prioritize that in our organizations. First of all, having that culture that you support a data-driven decision maker. And I think it's having the right data, and not just the right data, the complete data. And that's going to differ depending on the decision, what the scope is, the timeline, etc. You've got to look at to make that decision is going to differ from case to case. So it's empowering them, and I think it's supporting them by giving them that data. It's very difficult to make a decision based on incomplete data. And so something as we always look for, in terms of when we're building up the Splunk team, is somebody who's comfortable with those unknowns, and that, because that's what you have to deal with in there. But how do we fill those unknowns? Who's curious about those unknowns? Who's there? So it's really about, I think, creating that culture and then putting the tools in place to support them with that. And let's close the feedback loop. Let's feed the results back of our decisions into our modeling, so that it improves our modeling over time. It's not a once-off. It's an ongoing process that we're going to, much like your development, continuous improvement, continuous development there as well.
Super.
As for making, I think, as for, I see the other part of the question was how to make it pleasant rather than scary. For me, data-driven decision making is pleasant. It's not scary. It's so I think that might be a personality thing, and that might be something we can work on with people from a training perspective or whatever. It's embracing that use of data and realizing it's getting back to that AI thing. This is not about replacing people. This is about empowering people. There's always a space for human decisions. It's about being able to position humans to make better decisions by giving them the right data.
Super. Great comment. Paul, I'm not sure if you want to add on that. If not, I'll take another question.
Yeah, I think just to throw another curveball in there, we were talking about it earlier. I think the democratization of data is a big issue at the moment, especially we were talking about the Communications Act that is out there, still in the Benny Abrams document. And then we also saw as last night I was reading, the Chinese are doing the same. They're seeing data as a national asset and classifying it. So any data generated in the country may be the domain of the government. I mean, this is a scary new field, and it could have impact on the business models. And it seemed like South Africa was out on their own until I saw that document from the Chinese doing similar. And you can see how they, like the great firewalls and things like that. So I think the answer to it is also around, the better decision making, but there's some interesting stuff around mining the data that is there and the formats that it's in. We're starting to see people wanting to mine backup data, old data, et cetera, et cetera. So very interesting field.
But democratization is actually, gets me thinking. It's also about providing more access to data, giving more people access to the data. So it's not just the decision maker. It's it's easy to question somebody's decision if you haven't seen the data that they're making on. If that data is out there for everyone, then yeah, maybe Ishmael, the answer is actually on the question that democratization of data is the solution to making it more pleasant and less scary, because that's just going to empower everyone.
Super. We've got one or two more questions that I think are more product centric. So if those folks don't mind, I'm going to ask the Splunk team to get hold of them directly, because they're kind of Splunk centric questions. Himu, I hope we've answered your question around AI ops innovation, because I'm going to assume that it's that we've answered the question, because I just want to play a quick video. Sorry, I just need to make sure that when I activate it, I share sound, because I always make that mistake. I want to share with you a video of Eric Yuan talking about exactly this problem, just to wrap up, because we've got 3 minutes and this is a 1.5 minute video. So just listen to Eric Yuan talk about this. He's being interviewed by the CEO of Splunk, actually. And Eric Yuan is the CEO of Zoom. Let's listen to Eric describe the challenge.
I love it. I love it. I could see two core corporate values. Security is first and #1 priority, and data must be used for everything.
Yeah, to help you make the right decision, right, and give you insights to drive your innovation.
There's so much around us, and it's so hard for most human beings to wrap their minds around all the possibilities. One, all the sources of data, because it's invisible. And then all the possibilities if you can just tap the data. Over the past 6, 9, 12 months, what are the things that you know now that you wish you had known a year ago? Are there any of those great retrospectives that we could all take away as leaders, that if we get lucky enough to go through so much growth or change in such a short time period?
That's a great question. I would say 2 things. First of all, prior to this pandemic crisis, we built Zoom to serve for enterprise customers. Now I realize to serve for enterprise customers versus to serve for consumers, it's very different. And not only use case is different, but also the way the internal process, how to serve enterprise customers, and very different. Number 2 is you have to have a very scalable, world-class, the best tools deployed in your backend to safeguard your backend infrastructure like it's Splunk. Without all those services, when we have a 30 times more usage, we have no idea what's going on. That will cause a huge potential problem in terms of privacy and security. That's why to pick up the best, the tools and to help us to scale our backend. That's very important for us if we want to have overnight 30 times more traffic.
And there you have it, folks. I think you've heard it from Eric Yuan himself. It's all about data and visibility. Folks, I've got a whole bunch of questions around Splunk. So please, if the Splunk team can get those questions, contact the folks directly. I really just wanted to thank everyone for joining. Thank Paul and Robert for being part of this, to Obscura for helping to bring this live, and to thank the audience for your time. I hope you found this interesting. We're shortly going to announce the next episode in our series. We'll keep you all posted, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with all of you going forward. So thank you, folks. Hope you have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed this particular webinar. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.